So good afternoon, good morning, I guess. Good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, depending on where you're at. My name is Kyle King. I'm the Managing Director of Capacity Building National, and welcome back to another webinar in our 2021 webinar series between the International Emergency Management Society and Capacity Building National, and sponsored by the Institute for Security Governance. And today we got a pretty interesting webinar coming up with the Pacific Disaster Center. His name is not Steve, his name is Dan. But we will certainly get a wonderful presentation, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. Before we get started, though, of course, as always, there's a few administrative remarks that we will get through just to start out. So again, I'm Kyle, and joined here again, as always, by Harold, President of Teams. Harold, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
And of course, Dan Morat, the Senior Disaster Risk Specialist at Pacific Disaster Center. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure.
Actually, what time is it there?
It's 11 a.m. here,
Oh,
East
okay.
Coast. I'm on the East Coast of the U.S.
So. Oh, all right. Not too bad then.
No.
So just a few quick points, of course, as always. So if you want to let us know in the chat where you're joining us from, that's good for us to know. And also the Q&A feature is there. So we'll be collecting the questions and actually using those to answer the questions at the end of the presentation from Dan today. And it's great if you use that Q&A feature because it allows us to run a report for later on. So any questions that we do not get to or are not able to answer during the webinar itself, then we'll put those into our LinkedIn event group later on. So far, this is the 15th of 25 events for this year, 1,198 attendees in 66 nations so far. So it's growing quite considerably, and we very much appreciate your support and participation. And that LinkedIn group that I was talking about, this was just one of the ways that we could actually be able to sort of share information, but not have it to bother you so much with emails and things like that. So if you want to join the LinkedIn group, there's about 310 different emergency managers from around the world in there now, or in similar fields. And it's really great to have that group to post information, post the slides, post the recordings and things like that. So go ahead and join that event, and go ahead and follow CBI Teams and ISG on social media as well, just to stay ahead of what's going on. And as well as Pacific Disaster Center, while you're there, you might as well follow them as well and stay involved with what they're doing and follow them as well. So future webinars coming up include South Africa, Germany, Norway is coming up as well. And we have a two-part series on the future of emergency management with the University of Manchester. And Smart Cities, the Impetus Project, and Data Science and COVID Response are all coming up as we start to round out the series and round out towards the end of the year. And we'll keep you posted on where those or when those are going to happen as well. And just a quick note on professional development opportunities that are coming up. And so, of course, as you know, with Teams, we've mentioned it before if you've been here with us in the past, and the Teams international certifications of the TQC and TQAC are available for you. And that TQC certification and TQAC, those are specifically for, the TQC is for a certification for individual emergency managers with a nationally recognized professional certification or other individuals with documented competence and experience, practical or academic in international emergency and disaster management, whereas the TQAC is for individuals with proper education in emergency management, but who are lacking the practical experience. And so some of the objectives of these two qualifications and certifications is to certify the knowledge and competencies about international standards, requirements, and best practices necessary to create an international common understanding. And so that's what's a little bit different. It's really about the international aspects among those working in emergency and disaster management internationally. So take a look at the TQC and TQAC and go over to the Teams website. You'll find more information there in the future about in the future when you want to apply for these certifications. And of course, it would be remiss if I didn't mention that the CBI also has its own NATO Crisis Management Disaster Response course that we do in partnership with the Crisis Management Disaster Response Center of Excellence located in Bulgaria. And that's hosted by the University of California in Irvine. That starts on September 20th. So enrollment is now open. That's a two-part series and a 12-week course that's all administered 100% online. And you get 2 certificates when you complete that course. One is of course, from UCI, University of California for Professional Development, and the other is from NATO itself. So take a look at that as well. The link is down below. Now, I'll just pause here really quick, and Harold, I'll hand it over to you for any of your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle, and welcome everybody, wherever you are. And I just sent out a reminder of this meeting today, and there I also added a link to my annual report for Teams. So you find that on the message I sent you today. And because of July is often a vacation time in Europe. So we have prolonged the deadline for submitting an abstract for Team's annual conference this year. And this is for the peer review papers, which is now prolonged to 30th of August. So you can still submit, or you can also submit a practical paper, but the deadline there is actually September. But don't wait to do it. We like you to join us then in December with presentations. And and Dan, it's good to listen to you today. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Harold. And so now we'll just turn it over to you, Dan. And yeah, looking forward to your presentation.
Great, thanks. Let me just share my screen here. So thanks very much. I apologize that it says Steve Recca under my name. I was a last-minute swap for Steve. He's a great colleague. I'm going to do my best to be his stand-in, but it's an absolute pleasure to speak to each of you this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are in the world, about the Pacific Disaster Center. And I'd just like to give an overview on our mission, our goals, and how we reach those goals. So let me jump right into the presentation here. So first question is, who are we? Well, the Pacific Disaster Center is an applied research organization that's managed by the University of Hawaii, and our headquarters is located in Maui, Hawaii. But even though that P in PDC stands for Pacific, don't let that fool you. We have a global mission. We have over 65 partner countries. We have over 200 partner engagements around the globe. We're managing and monitoring and responding to thousands of disasters everywhere across the globe. And we have 6 global locations. Actually, I think that's 7 now. So we have to update our slide to be able to provide support and for response and preparedness throughout the entire globe. So our mission is to build resilience by enabling effective, evidence-based decision-making across all phases of emergency management to support disaster risk reduction, preparedness, disaster response, really all phases of disaster management. So at a glance, it's important to know who's using our systems. We're working hand in hand with partners literally across the globe, and in this particular picture, that is our director, Mr. Ray Shirkodai, and Adelina Kamal from the AHA Center. So we have a close connection to ASEAN and to the AHA Center, the ASEAN Center for Humanitarian Assistance, and global and regional organizations, so that we can support specific needs across the globe. So who is using our system? Really, it again spans the globe. So starting with the US, we have our DisasterAWARE system, and our data and our science and information is being incorporated into decision-making within the DoD, within the Pentagon, within the combatant commands, within the White House, DHS and FEMA, at the State Department, Veterans Affairs, state EOCs, and then internationally, we probably need to update our nations that are using our systems and our data and information. It's probably becoming too long of a list for a single slide, but we work with international organizations, including the UN, ASEAN, SEDIMA, Preparedness. So these are the regional disaster management organizations for ASEAN, for the Caribbean, and for Central America. We're working with the American Red Cross and the World Food Program, Salvation Army, and again, more to list. But again, this is a global mission, and I always like to make this point because it's often the assumption that because we're called Pacific Disaster Center that we focus primarily on the Pacific. That's where we're located, our headquarters, but we're really working globally. This map kind of supports our global mission statement and gives you an idea of the places that we've worked around the world. So we've had lots of projects, of course, in the Asia Pacific region, but also Central America, the Caribbean, South America, We've expanded recently into West Africa, Europe. So we really are supporting a global mission for evidence-based research and decision-making. And all of this is with the goal of preventing hazards from becoming disasters and preventing disasters from becoming catastrophes. And so the next question is, what is PDC? We're this applied research organization, but really where do we sit? And we have two primary communities that are serving the emergency and disaster management stakeholder mission set. And so for a long time, just speaking personally in my career, I sat in the science community, and um, some of the things that distinguish the science community is the audience, the comfort with uncertainty, the vocabulary that we use, and the associations that we have that support our positions. And there's a bit of a disconnect here as you see that our audience is really in academia is focused on peer review, whereas decision makers and emergency managers are dealing with the general public. Our comfort with uncertainty as scientists in the academic community is very low. It often prevents research from going out the door or being applied because we're often unable to cope with low uncertainty in our information. Decision makers, on the other hand, if you have no information, you have some information, or if you have all the information in the world, decision makers still and emergency managers still need to make the decision. So they're acknowledging that the comfort with uncertainty is high, the decision-making process is reflexive. When it comes to vocabulary, we're talking very scientific, technical information on the science community and more simple, actionable information. So with all of this, you see a bit of a disconnect. So where does PDC really lie? And the answer is it's bridging the two. As a scientist working in the field for about the last 10 years before I started to work with PDC, I found that I was writing papers and I was submitting articles and trying to apply science to real world problems. But that's kind of where it ended. I would publish the paper and that was it. So at PDC, we're taking that cutting edge science and information and translating that into actionable decision support. And so how do we do that? Our approach to informed decision-making is pretty simple. So it starts with providing pertinent, up-to-date information that's grounded in science. And we make it widely accessible through innovative and interactive technologies so that we can promote the exchange of information through comprehensive support services for disaster planning and risk reduction, through stakeholder engagement and collaboration. And so this integrated approach starts with advances in observational and collection systems. So we know that there are a number of different ways that we can observe and monitor hazard and disaster activity. And those, of course, change from high resolution satellite imagery, radar information. There's a few examples here. There, tsunami buoys. We're taking all this monitoring information, and that's kind of how we're starting. The second part is to take that scientific or highly technical information and place that into a model to talk about impacts. So what is our risk? What is our potential for loss? And translating that scientific or technical information into risk analysis and often mapping it so that we can see where the differences in risk lie and how we might need to address that in different ways. And finally, GIS and visualization plays an important role in this because we know that disasters are inherently spatial. The first questions of what and where, how much and how many, these answers can be more easily addressed through a map. And so we're incorporating all of that information into a flagship system that we call DisasterAWARE, which is an online map-based system, but it doesn't require any GIS expertise or background. It is really built for the disaster management and emergency management community. And taking all that information and placing that into advancements in computing and communication technologies, we're actually serving this information back out in a number of different ways through our DisasterAWARE system. so that we can access this information from a smartphone, from a tablet, from a computer, that multiple ways and high availability of the system, so that it's there and it's ready for decision makers to bring the information right to their fingertips. So, you know, this integration is really about identifying the most accurate scientific information, combining it with these other pieces that I had just mentioned, and basically about converting information into improved decision support capabilities. And so if we talk about, you know, that what is the data? What is the data and information that support decision making for disaster management? Well, it's more than one source. We certainly know that. And if we were to look at all of these sources separately, it's a huge burden in terms of time and access to be able to separately monitor social media, remotely sensed information, real-time hazard advisories, because we know that there's no one-stop shop for hazard advisories. Some come from USGS, some come from National Hurricane Center, Joint Typhoon Warning Center, based on where we are in the world. And so we're combining satellite imagery, historical data, GIS data that we can actually place into a map with real-time alerts. And the point of all of this is we needed a way to combine all this information kind of in that one-stop shop into a system that we call PDC's DisasterAWARE, which functions for data integration, visualization, and information mashups, so that we have all of the access to all the data and information that basically serves the decision-making community. And we're converting that into actionable risk intelligence. So all the data in the world, even when you have all the data in the world, the expectation that you're a subject matter expert is in all of that information is non-realistic. So PDC takes our mission a little bit further to actually convert that information. So we're providing it in one place, consolidating it, and then actually turning it into actionable risk intelligence for policymakers and elected officials, for disaster managers, and for executives. And here's an example of some of the gaps and challenges when we talk about real-time hazard information. And for example, we have this hurricane advisory shown here. This is not very fun to read. It's hard to digest. There's information that's kind of scattered about. Not all of it is actionable, and there's a lack of situational awareness, and dissemination is limited, right? We actually have to go out and gather this information. We might get some automation in terms of emails or how we receive it, but getting this all into one spot is a major hurdle to provide adequate insight. Here's another example of an earthquake advisory where we're just looking at dates and latitudes and longitudes and depths. But again, it's not really telling us, another example with a tsunami advisory, it's not really telling us what the action should be. And the effort required to decipher this and turn that into actionable information is often not something that people on the ground have time to do. So that's a service that PDC is trying to, has tried to and has successfully incorporated into DisasterAWARE so that risks can be understood. Because when information isn't understood, as shown by this, this complicated sign, it's not particularly useful. And when we serve out information to disaster managers and people on the ground, the decision makers, and it's not useful, then we're actually doing a disservice. It's a waste of time and effort. So how do we overcome these challenges? So we're providing tools for decision makers, and this is kind of the splash screen for our DisasterAWARE system. It's called EMOps. Our EMOps system is accessible to all stakeholders in disaster and emergency management. It is available for free. You do have to sign up because we want to make sure that this system is provided not to the public, but to people in the disaster management community. So there is a registration process, but it's free to do, and it's available to you as long as you're working and supporting disaster and emergency management. So from my last slide to this slide, so we're taking strides to simplify, automate, and integrate all that information. And so when there is a hurricane advisory from National Hurricane Center, we're turning that into information on the map. We're combining that with pertinent spatial information. So if I know I have a hurricane, but here's my hurricane path, and I'm incorporating that with other pieces of information to take information like maximum wind gusts and turn that into to possible expected impacts. So if I'm looking at a wind speed, I want to know at a glance if I should expect a few trees or a few branches to be knocked down, or are we talking about a wind speed that can rip roofs off of homes? That's the action that we want to take through the integration of different pieces of information and serve that actionable information out to the emergency and disaster management community. So that includes estimating impacts, as I mentioned, and we do. You'll see in a few slides, I'll get into more detail, but we do subscribe to services like TAUS, which is called the Arbiter of Storms, and that's a service that basically takes 3 different impacts types from hurricanes, so wind, heavy rainfall, and storm surge, and actually combines those into expected impacts. We also widely disseminate this information. So through DisasterAWARE, which is available again to all the disaster management community, you can get all of these pieces. So not just the alert. What you're seeing here on the mobile device is actually an alert. So when a new real-time advisory comes out, if you subscribe to alerts, and there's 2 different ways you can do that through DisasterAWARE. You can log in to EMOps. You can set up SMS and email alerts so that when new and unfolding information comes into the system, you get that directly on your phone or through your email. And secondarily, we have an app called the Disaster Alert app. And when new information comes out there, you can get through the app directly to your phone. I will say that EMOps is accessible through all devices, so you can get it on your cell phone. You don't necessarily have to download the app. You can access the website, and all of those alerts, we're widely disseminating and aggregating all of those alerts in one spot and combining it with the geospatial information to help support decision making. As we get updates or as we're involved, PDC does play a role in international response, often through request. Anyone can request disaster response support by sending an email to response@pdc.org. And we're happy to support as best we can the missions for response and decision making. So another piece of this is helping to anticipate needs. And so when we talk about like exposures to hazards, we're using things, we're trying to use that impacted area and our base understanding of the population to be able to dictate things like basic water needs through the SPHERE guidelines. And so it's not just the hazard and where it's happening, it's who and what are likely to be affected and what might those needs be. In addition, we want to take into account socioeconomic risk and vulnerability. And so this is an example of our subnational risk and vulnerability program. Actually, it also includes disaster management capabilities program called the National Disaster Preparedness Baseline Assessment. I have a few slides on that forthcoming here. But we want to take that real-time hazard information and also compare that to vulnerabilities and coping capacities to be able to determine where resilience might be lacking and where additional help might be needed to support the community to respond to and recover from the impacts of those disasters. We also want to translate scientific data into actionable information. And so if we can bring in tropical cyclone tracks and have readily available in our system the evacuation zones, it's one less step that emergency managers have to take to be able to translate science and information into action. In addition to just serving this information out into a system, PDC is not a passive operation. We have an active global mission that includes providing capacity building opportunities for practitioners around the world. So we support workshops and engagements all over the world for disaster risk reduction and resilience building, help to identify how we can take data and information and turn that into evidence-based decision-making for the emergency management community. We conduct training, we conduct exercises. We actually have dedicated staff to supporting global exercises. And in so doing, it also allows us to leverage DisasterAWARE, and it helps with the education of data and systems that are freely available to emergency managers around the world. So it's not something that we conduct from behind. PDC's mission and operations are not something that are conducted from behind a computer. We are getting out in the community. We do travel around the globe to provide these capacity building opportunities for practitioners around the globe. So I talked a little bit about DisasterAWARE, which again is our flagship online map-based service. And I just want to talk briefly about some of the key features of DisasterAWARE. So first and foremost, we have real-time hazard information and historical hazard information. So we're able to look back at past events and past flood inundations, let's say, so that we can leverage that past information to be able to anticipate impacts of forthcoming storms or hazards. That includes integrated modeling. So I mentioned the Taos model, the arbiter of storms. I mentioned there are other models that we leverage, for example, Pacific Northwest National Labs and anticipating flood impacts. And so it's not a single data source, it's an aggregation and integration of multiple modeling capabilities and putting that information into one space so that it can be accessed. We have spatial maps and notifications. So if you wanted to set up alerts, you get your account on DisasterAWARE, you log in, you can actually set up specific alerts for yourself, and you can set a bounding box or a spatial area where you're interested. So your area of responsibility, you can highlight specific hazard types, you can highlight specific warning levels, which is good because if we just have information versus a warning for a hurricane, we don't want our phone to be going off every 30 seconds. So we want to know, for example, I've set my alerts primarily for rapid onset hazards at the warning level. So when things are starting to happen, then I get my alert on my phone, and it's for the specific area that I've chosen. We also integrate analytical reports and assessments. So through the international disaster risk reduction and global response community, sit reps, and any type of information analysis that's coming out as an event is unfolding, we aggregate that as well. So you have the sit reps, the spatial data, and the real-time hazard information, monitoring information, kind of all one spot. We also understand that there's a baseline of information that's useful for decision making, regardless of where it's happening or what the type of disaster is. So understanding critical infrastructure on a global scale and baseline demographic information is some of the core data that aids in decision making. In addition, just observations and forecasts, basic population information. I had mentioned the collaboration with sit reps here for both analytical reports and any type of analytical information that comes out during an event. That's all aggregated and available to you on DisasterAWARE. So it's also touch friendly on mobile devices, so you don't have to be on a computer. It's compatible with all devices and browsers. Users can import geospatial data, I believe, as a KML right now. There's also a bookmarking function. So say you're looking at a number of layers that you think, wow, this is really telling the story that the folks on the ground need to know. It's combining sitrep information, with demographic information, with real-time monitoring information, you can actually create a map, turn on the layers that you'd like, zoom into the area of pertinence, and save that as a bookmark and send it out to the other stakeholders who might be working in the field or another EOC or another location, so that they're looking at the same data and information that you're looking at. When you have a system that is as comprehensive as DisasterAWARE with thousands and thousands of layers, it's often hard to communicate, I'm looking at this specific one. So bookmarks that are shareable and being able to kind of set up the same view and share that view as events are unfolding is of critical value. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on that capability specifically. There's also a data file exchange for geospatial layers. So if you'd like information from your organization to be accessible in DisasterAWARE, or there's something in DisasterAWARE that's particularly important to you, as long as we don't have a data sharing agreement that prevents us from sharing, we're happy to share that information back with stakeholders. So I had also mentioned the Disaster Alert app, which can be downloaded on your phone, and basically that it functions in a similar way to the disaster alerts or smart alerts that you can set up through DisasterAWARE directly. But this is, at its core, it's just sending you information as we have major hazards and alerts. And the way that we determine new hazards and alerts, part of it is automated, but PDC also has some manual hazards, and we're also looking at automating hazards that right now don't have, a global reporting or a global coverage. For example, wildfires or geopolitical events, and incorporating that into disaster alert as well. So I want to talk a little bit, I'd mentioned some of our response support and just highlight some of the other pieces that go into that. And so PDC does have dedicated response staff. We have our key capabilities are comprehensive, ranging from early warning and notifications, decision support that comes automatically through DisasterAWARE, situational awareness products, and custom mapping. And so as new events are unfolding, we're actually seeking out new data and information, damage and needs assessment, getting that into a GIS format, putting that into DisasterAWARE. We can do pre-impact needs assessments. We also offer subject matter expertise in the areas of disaster management analysis, risk and vulnerability assessment, which is primarily where I work at PDC, and global health hazard evaluations. And so how does PDC, the next question might be, how does PDC facilitate global response? And it's through we have a global presence. What you're seeing here, all these orange dots, are locations where we have staff. So I'm here in the Washington, D.C. area. Steve Recca, who I know, thank you for changing my name on there. Steve Recca, who was originally lined up to give the talk today, is here in Colorado Springs. We have folks in Brazil. We have folks in Bangkok, in Jakarta. We have folks, obviously, in Maui, where our headquarters is, but also Oahu. So what this does, by having a geographically dispersed team, it allows us, in cases of extreme emergency, to provide round-the-clock support for any stakeholder in disaster management and for users of the system. And so you heard me talk about this TAOS model, which is really a pre-impact modeling capability that combines pre-impact modeling for 3 different types of hazards that all come out of really hurricanes. So potential wind impacts, rainfall, and stillwater storm surge, which updates automatically with each new advisory. And with each advisory, you get the geographic data in the system, but there's also soft copy product where we combine these maps and information. Here are some examples of what those soft copy products are. These are posted to the system as well. They can be downloaded and included in other briefings. But at a glance, you see here from Hurricane Irma, we have estimated wind impacts in a very easy to consume and understand way. So ranging from our dark green, where we're going to have some small trees swaying, up to our purple, where we expect catastrophic damage in the areas that are exposed to the storm there. And we're combining that with estimated storm surge and rainfall. So we're getting a comprehensive view of the impacts from a hurricane event, and not just focusing on, just storm surge flooding or just wind impacts. We also have another product called the All Hazard Impact Model. And this provides scientifically reliable information about built environment in terms of the replacement value of capital stock and population exposures, including vulnerable populations. So this helps guide preparedness actions. And as we have new hazard zones coming in, as we start to understand, for example, these Taos models, as we're able to bring those in, we can quickly translate the hazard zone into exposures. And now we're talking about, how many people, how many households are exposed, and what is the age breakdown there? So do we have vulnerable populations in terms of the elderly or children? And what does that look like? So again, just a translation from hazard to exposure gets us closer to actionable information for the disaster management community. Here's another example where we're taking observed flood inundation, and we're converting that into capital exposure. So what should we expect in terms of replacement costs if everywhere that's exposed to this hazard is completely destroyed? What's our capital stock exposure? And again, just another example from Taos. Another kind of practical application in terms of our presence, both in terms of international collaboration and translation of science and information into action, is this joint analysis of disaster exposure, or our JADE products that we release in coordination with UN OCHA and the World Food Program. So here we have vulnerable population breakdowns in terms of exposure to this Philippine earthquake in Gutad. And we're also breaking that down into people living in affected areas, in terms of the worst affected area, and then how many people are vulnerable in terms of poverty, elderly, children, and then potential costs to rebuild, which again come out of that all hazards impact AIM model, which PDC runs. We also look at pre and post impact imagery. So one of the requests that we often get from stakeholders is, it's very recent after the impacts. Can PDC find some information for us so that we can anticipate or start to understand some of the damages and some of the effects on critical infrastructure? And so this was for Hurricane Irma, and we had some requests about understanding, or do we have any imagery to be able to support an understanding of impacts on water resources. So we went out and we found UAV information, UAS information, and brought that in to DisasterAWARE. We also created this product so we could focus on specific neighborhoods here and the visual impact, just to be able to transfer that back to folks and first responders on the ground. Finally, I want to touch on our risk and vulnerability program, again, because this is the program that I primarily support. So we assess risk really at all spatial scales. We have a global risk and vulnerability assessment that has global coverage at the country level. And this actually breaks risk down into the elements of multi-hazard exposure, vulnerabilities and socioeconomic sensitivities, and then coping capacity. So the resources that we can bring, that countries can bring to bear some of those exposures and vulnerabilities. We also do this at a subnational level through something called the National Disaster Preparedness Baseline Assessment. I am the program manager for this assessment. And what we do there is, it always starts with a request. We know that there are countries that are more susceptible to repeated impacts, and it starts with a request from the country, facilitated through the U.S. Embassy, to be able to break down and understand the global risk at the subnational level. And so this is just an example from Vietnam. And what the NDPBA does is it starts with risk and vulnerability assessment, but it includes disaster management analysis because that gives us context of how risk is going to be managed within the country. And it's not just from the perspective of a national disaster management organization, it's all the other ministries and agencies, NGOs, private sector stakeholders that are involved in various phases of disaster management. This is facilitated through stakeholder coordination through the entire process. And so we conduct these subnational assessments over about a year's timeline. It's facilitated through constant data and information exchange. So it's actually in-country collaboration with local stakeholders and subject matter experts. And that's what helps provide the context and value back to the assessment. Finally, all of PDC's products are meant to be action oriented. And so if we just made a few maps, we combined a few different data sets and information together, it doesn't bridge the gap between the information and the actions that you can take. So we actually take it one step further. We identify the drivers of risk and vulnerability and maybe some of the challenges in disaster management. And we turn that into recommendations that can be implemented in a disaster risk reduction 5-year action plan. And you also see that several elements represented here on this chart are aligned with the Sendai framework. So we're trying to operationalize an assessment that feeds directly into commitments to the Sendai framework, the global framework for disaster risk reduction. And our methodology is simple in that we start with the components of risk. We know that risk is very complex. And so we have this hierarchical model where we're trying to break down and measure this in thematic ways so that we can get from complex concept to action that you can take. And so, for example, we know that vulnerability, and these are just sample subcomponents. We don't continuously do cookie cutter research. So all of these are aligned with the context and the needs of the country every time we start a baseline assessment. But just for example's sake, we want to break vulnerability down into elements that get us closer to action or help align us with specific lines of effort that stakeholders carry out. And again, not just a disaster management organization. So population pressures and gender inequalities, economic constraints, access to clean water and health status, environmental stress, conflict, and recent disaster impacts. That helps us get to specific actions, lines of efforts, and stakeholders that we can actually take for disaster risk reduction. And so once we've done our thematic assessment, we actually start to gather the data then. And so you can see kind of this hierarchy from concept to individual data set that we might measure. So we know that infant mortality is an element of maternal and child health, which is an element of health status, which is an element of vulnerability. And this hierarchical model allows us to make sure that each element that we're measuring actually aligns with an action. The second piece, and these are actually, they're not separate, they're happening together and at the same time, as our disaster management analysis, which really contextualizes the risk and vulnerability assessment, helps guide those recommendations, because we're not doing this risk and vulnerability assessment in a black box. The application is for disaster risk reduction. And so the disaster management analysis looks comprehensively at all those different players and stakeholders and what the status and the challenges is of the challenges are of things like multi-stakeholder coordination, legal authorities, enabling environments for disaster management, public buy-in, and how all of that information really, the risk information filters through that context to be able to make meaningful recommendations in the end. And so all of this to say, this is my last slide here, all of this to say, PDC's goal always has been to provide evidence-based decision-making, and that's not singular. So we're providing evidence-based decision-making as tools for decision makers and accessibility to disaster-aware and real-time information. Knowledge for policymakers. So what are the implications of risk on disaster governance and how do we actually address this from the policy side. And then finally, capacity for practitioners. So as we know that people are on the ground and doing preparedness, response, recovery activities, how can we provide information that makes their job easier and removes some of the guesswork that is involved or assumptions that have to be involved with a lack of information? So how do we provide that information to enable decision support? I welcome you all to follow us on our social media. To get in touch with us, you can always send an email to info@pdc.org. I'll also share my contact information, Steve's contact information. But this is the end of our slideshow, and I'm happy to facilitate any discussion or questions that you may have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dan. It was very informative. If you don't mind, could we keep your slides up for a couple seconds? I'd like to go back just for a little bit when you were talking about, I think it was on the governance sector, and you kind of had a data stream going in. Yeah, so let's talk about that one for a second, just out of my own curiosity. And we've got a few questions here that we'll get to from the attendees. You had mentioned that it's and from what I understood, you can clarify if I'm wrong, but it's quite difficult to quantify these things, right? Institutional arrangements, enabling environment, governance, and these kind of, as you said, multi-stakeholder arrangements. How are you able to quantify those things? That seems quite difficult.
That's a great question, and I didn't clarify enough. So our disaster management analysis, the reason we implemented it is because of that exact reason. A lot of these pieces, with the exceptions of like emergency management capabilities in terms of firefighters, shelters capacities, there are elements of that we include in the RVA, but much of these arrangements really come through a comprehensive document research and understanding of the status of plans. So the DMA is really, for the most part, kind of the qualitative complement to the risk and vulnerability assessment. We've got all these maps and numbers, but the how and the challenges and roadblocks that we might have to implementation to address those numbers really comes through to the disaster management analysis. So you're right, Kyle, it's mostly quantitative, and thanks for that question. Qualitative, sorry. Thanks for the question.
No problem. So that's really interesting. So you gather your data, and then you have to do this analysis and try and overlay sort of the intangible aspects of it, I suppose.
Yep, and that's what gets us really to the action. That's what gets us there, the extra mile.
Okay, very interesting. Thanks. So let's go to some questions from the audience really quick. So, to obtain relevant information from interagency departments to be included in the DisasterAWARE program within a country will require extensive amount of work and input. So you had mentioned, obviously, and I'm going to kind of go off that question for a second, but you'd mentioned, of course, go to the country team, go to the embassy, request support from PDC. You go in to a nation, and as the question is saying, it requires extensive amount of work and input. How do you advise the country to move forward on those things?
Yeah, so the process is facilitated through a close stakeholder collaboration all throughout the process. So we usually have a number of knowledge exchanges. So we start off where we're really getting to know the stakeholders in the country, so that we're providing context and we're connecting the dots. Sometimes in terms of how difficult this is, sometimes there's not opportunities for stakeholders and NGOs, private sector, and the NDMO all to get in the same room and talk about the piece of disaster management that they represent. So that in-country stakeholder collaboration is a critical piece to the baseline assessment's success overall. Throughout the project, it's actually not a one-stop. So we will stay and work with subject matter experts and disaster management practitioners. We'll gather as much information as we can, and then take that back to PDC, quantify as much as we can, and perform the analysis. And then there's repeated stakeholder facilitation. And so at the midpoint, if we're doing this over a year, at the midpoint, ideally what we'd like to do is share what our gaps are in our assessment and provide our preliminary findings. And humble as I'd like to be, you walk into a room and sometimes a stakeholder will say, you missed the mark, and that's okay. because again, that stakeholder collaboration is really what guarantees our success and the validation of all of this. And so when we come to the end of the project and we have this 5-year plan and recommendations, all of which has been facilitated through, again, that stakeholder engagement, we're identifying inroads through PDCs, global contacts, regional contacts, and basically connecting the dots to be able to carry out some of those elements of the 5-year plan. And so I would say every country, every assessment kind of has its own little nuances and how we carry that out. But the identification of stakeholders and tying them to an action or a line of effort that aligns with our recommendations, that's really how we end the project. And once we've delivered our results, that's not the end of our collaboration. That's really the springboard into how PDC can help serve and help facilitate some of those recommendations that we've made after a project has ended. So it's not just a one-time trip in country to gather information, produce the assessment. It is a regular collaboration with multiple stakeholders. And even when a project is done, our engagement is not done. And I would say there's no one size fits all, but it's through the identification, again, of lines of effort and of specific sectors or elements of disaster risk reduction, how we align those two.
Okay, good. Thanks. So next question is, early warning systems on climate change and extreme weather events are rarely integrated with risk assessment and impact assessment on agricultural related activities. This will be useful for decision makers and managers on preparedness and response. What do you think about possible systems for these kinds of early warning systems?
Yeah. So when we talk about climate change, the one issue that we've had, going back to a much earlier slide, is really about uncertainty. But the fact of the matter is, if we can incorporate, and we're working towards this as the Pacific Disaster Center, into identifying sources of information to look at these things more long term, and how we serve that goal of getting from monitoring to action. We are collaborating as PDC with UN Inform, which has a number of products where they're looking at estimating or anticipating long-term impacts of climate change and getting the word out early. So we're collaborating with a number of different organizations to bring that climate change information together. That's one of our goals, where we're building that capacity and capability out and putting that information in DisasterAWARE so that seasonal or long-term climate change impacts are available, and for multiple sectors, as you mentioned, agriculture, but multi-sectoral in terms of health, agricultural impacts, industry, and the cascading impacts of things like water stress that might have further reaching implications for development, industrial expansion. These are priorities for us in being able to address the concern of climate change, and that is one of our annual priorities, is building out the capacities for us to be able to do that modeling and include that information in DisasterAWARE for those stakeholders that need that information.
Okay, interesting. So let's stay on that topic really quick, about as far as the information and DisasterAWARE and others. So what about PDC and its relationship with GDACs and other sort of organizations? So
Yeah.
what is sort of the information exchange that you have with the United Nations or European Union or anywhere else in terms of that broad sort of partnership?
Yes. So GDACs and DisasterAWARE talk to each other. so,
Okay, great.
we are closely related and closely integrated with the UN. We talked about UN OCHA and how some of the information through our combined products and JADE, that joint disaster exposure product, WFP. So there is a bi-directional flow of information to UN and through GDACs of information that PDC is able to consume, and the value-add products that we create, and the information that's coming out of GDACs as well. So bidirectional integration of information and close partnership with the organizations that manage GDACs, absolutely.
Okay, and so there's another question that's sort of very similarly related to that. So I'll just go ahead and get to that question here. But can you elaborate more on the collaboration with the UN? For example, not just in the data exchange, maybe, but the request from a UN agency like World Food Program or OCHA. Is there any agreement to be established between your organizations and the UN? So is it just GDACs, or is there also other collaborative relationships
No,
within the
no,
UN
no.
system?
So we are in the and I'm sure Steve could answer this question more readily, but we're either in the
No problem.
process or we have created a MOU and a collaborative agreement between these UN agencies, and so it's not just limited to the JADE products or the GDACs, and that's part of making sure that we have the regional buy-in as we're doing some of these subnational assessments. We're actually, again, signing those MOUs and agreements for bidirectional flow of information, and then also creating priority partnerships for those organizations that are involved in disaster management from the UN side. The specifics of
Okay.
which Steve would be able to answer. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. We can send him the question as well, and
Yeah.
he can elaborate. We'll
Yeah.
post it in the LinkedIn group.
Okay.
Let's see. But no, that's it. That's a good answer. Thank you. Um, I understood that civil, military, emergency management organizations and units will be able to rely on your extremely valuable and timely information, data, and estimation through different digital and mobile tools. Has PDC also a kind of rapid deployable teams who could directly assist with customers in the field if requested or required?
We have done that. So, for example, during Hurricane Dorian uh, in the Bahamas, we did have a regular team that was basically serving the purposes of emergency support functions of data and information and mapping. So we actually do go into the field. We do train people on DisasterAWARE as events are unfolding. I think we could facilitate a request as it comes in. It is something that we have done. I'm sure it's something that we would be happy to do moving forward as well. But we've also done training for forward deployed teams. So I know we've worked kind of across the globe with that as well. This is another question that I know Steve would be able to answer better than me, but I know that capability does fall within our umbrella of support.
Okay, and I think we have the last question here, which is good because we're about to run out of time. Does the PDC build on local government RFP, RFQs for risk identification, mitigation, planning projects in other nations?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, that's the short answer. But particularly through the National Disaster Preparedness Baseline Assessment Program, that's really where we enter. Our universe is really the country, and the stakeholders range from the national level to, say a provincial level, the whole way down to the local level, and incorporating indigenous information into risk understanding and risk reduction is a priority for PDC. Understanding best practices that have been useful in particular communities that may be repeatedly exposed to floods, and transferring that information back up to the provincial level and other areas across the AOR or the country. That is an element of what we're trying to accomplish with the baseline assessment, and we've had some success with it as well. That information sharing and kind of democratization of information and best practices, it's bi-directional. It flows in both directions, and yes, that is an element of what we're trying to accomplish for our DRR and NDPBA programs.
Okay, great. All right, Dan, thank you very much. And so once again, our webinar series, as we're closing out, just to remind you that this is sponsored by the Institute for Security Governance and the Civil Military Emergency Preparedness Program. If you have any questions about ISG and the work that they're doing over there, then you can go ahead and contact Mr. Scott Moreland or Ashley Woodson over at NPS, and they'll be able to answer any questions that you might have, from institutional capacity building to civil military emergency preparedness or any other sort of questions and programs they might have. Check them out at the Institute for Security Governance.org. And right now, I'll just say thanks a lot. Thanks, Dan and PDC, very much. And Harold, do you have any final comments?
Yeah, this was very interesting. Actually, I met one of your representatives out, I think it was in either Korea or Thailand, just after 2000, and I haven't been in contact since then. But I think I would like to follow up because we have many contacts around the world which might be very interested in your services and how can we spread this information, how can we set you up with them. I like to come back on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That sounds wonderful. We'd love to be in contact.
Yep, thank you, and thank you all.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. And Dan, yeah, definitely something to follow up on. And then hopefully we'll see you in the future. Maybe Steve will be back by then, right?
Maybe.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.